last week, we're just moving the spot of the meditation just as an experiment to see what happens. So after the sermon, then we'll have 3 minutes of silence. Last week, we finished the sermon by inviting you into an exercise. So if you don't know what I'm talking about, I'll catch you up. And if you do, maybe this will provide some inspiration or some encouragement. We talked about the idea that God has created and is creating. And we said that part of life is participating in that co-creation. And part of life is observing what's already there. So we invited everyone into an exercise. More about this exercise can be found on this green sheet. If you didn't get one, there are more at the back. And what we want you to do is this. We want you to take up a practice for the month of May. It could be anything. For some of you, it might be taking 20 minutes outside to do nothing and just be still. That's the one I chose, and I'll tell you about that in a moment. For others of you, maybe you're the creative tactile type, and you want to create something. So you take driftwood and you make some sort of beautiful piece of art out of it, or you take a photo a day and you document something. So take up that practice, whatever that might be. Maybe journaling, maybe picture taking, maybe something creative, and see what comes out of it. On the 31st, I'm not here, but you'll be here. And so our sermon together is the sharing of those experiences. So if you took a photo a day, maybe you share one of your photos with us and why it was important for you. Or if you sat outside and tried to be quiet for a time, what was that like? And you can share your experiences about that. And it sounds scary, but all we want is like a minute or a minute and a half, and we'll share these experiences together. We'll give you a little bit more information about that every week. And next week, Janet or Kathleen will tell you about one of their experiences, and the week after, the other will tell you about their experience, so you know that we're all in this together. Okay, so I chose the 20 minutes of quiet. And my brain has such a problem turning off. So there's a little stream by our house, just like 50 yards from our house. So I tried to go down there, and I tried to be quiet. So I sat down there, and maybe lasted 5 minutes, maybe 10 minutes, because my brain was just flitting off to all these different places. But I tried to work on my breathing. So I breathed in, and I paused, and I breathed out, and paused, and I tried this, and got somewhere. But here's the thing. I didn't do it every day. I really tried hard to. I really wanted to. And I didn't. Maybe I was too busy. Maybe I was nervous about what I would hear in the silence. I don't know. So I tell you all this to give you hope. If you tried to take up a practice and it failed miserably, it's okay. It's a practice for a reason. So we want you to take up these practices and see what happens. But for the rest of the sermon, I want to talk about A&W and why A&W is like a mountain. Okay? Ken's the only one that thought it was funny. Yeah. Sermon over, done. So I want to say A&W is a little bit like a mountain. Now, first I need to explain about A&W. So I don't go to A&W a lot, but when I do, there's one thing I expect: onion rings. Like, they make the most delicious onion rings in the world, right? Just the right amount of salt, it's spices, it's deep fried, it's onion, it's so good. Now, if I were to go to an A&W and there wouldn't be any onion rings, I might as well not be there. Like, that's how much the onion rings, for me, are important at A&W. Which brings us to mountains. There's an expectation in the Old Testament, well, maybe in the New Testament too, that when a mountain appears, that when a mountain is the setting for a story, that God will appear too. And so if you're reading along in these stories and God doesn't appear, something's up. Much like if you were to go to A&W and there wouldn't be onion rings. If you go to a mountain and there isn't God. I don't think this is a stretch, is it? So we expect something at the mountain. We expect that God will show up. Now, let me give you my defense for this. So first of all, Mount Horeb, Exodus 3, there's a man named Moses. We've talked a lot about Moses since I've been here. And Moses is tending the flock of his father-in-law. And they're walking around the desert, and eventually they come to Mount Horeb. And here's what happens. Now Moses was taking care of his flock, of his father-in-law, Jethro, the religious leader of Midian. He led the flock to the west side of the desert and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. And there the angel showed himself to Moses in a burning fire from inside a bush. You all know this story, right? Moses looked and saw that the bush was burning with fire, but it was not being burned up. So Moses said, I must step aside and see this great thing, why the bush is not being burned up. Now, Israel is under captivity. They're looking for freedom. And freedom comes from a message on the mountain where God says, Moses, go and free my people. Go up on the mountain, there's a burning bush, and God is seen. Okay, same character, different mountain, Mount Sinai. The people have been led out of Egypt, and they find themselves trying to figure out what they're going to do now. They're trying to figure out how they're going to be a new society. God says to Moses, I'm going to appear on the mountain. So the people gather all around the foot of Mount Sinai. And this is what the text says. On the morning of the third day, there was thunder and lightning. A cloud covered the mountain, and a very loud horn sounded. And all the people among the tents shook with fear. Then Moses brought the people from among the tents to meet God. They stood at the base of the mountain, and Mount Sinai was all up in smoke because the Lord came down upon it in fire. Its smoke went up like the smoke of a stove. And the horn became louder and louder. And Moses spoke, and God answered him with thunder. There's a mountain. And on the mountain, they expect to see God. Now, this story continues for a long time. Mount Sinai is in a lot of trouble. It's a lot of turmoil. And out of it eventually comes the 10 Commandments. So we have the same character, but two different mountains. And both of these mountains, God appears. So we add a third mountain to the mix, Mount Carmel. Not caramel, Carmel. Giant ball of sticky popcorn or something. No, it's Mount Carmel. And so different character and different mountain. And this time, it's Elijah. Now, I just read the story for the other day, and I was, what do we say? He follows after Moses. He's a prophet. He wants to see Israel prosper. But the thing is, Israel is not prospering. They've had King Saul, they've had King David, they've had King Solomon, and things have been pretty good, but things have been falling apart. And they've had a series of kings that have not been good. And we come to this story of Ahab, and Ahab is the worst king that Israel has. So Israel is falling apart. And one of the reasons Israel is falling apart is because in the story, there's idolatry. The people are worshiping a god that they're not supposed to. And this god's name is Baal. And Ahab's wife, Jezebel, who is equally as wicked as Ahab, is kind of the chief promoter of these prophets. And the text says there are like 450 prophets of Baal. So Elijah is one of the few prophets of God left. And Jezebel has been out getting rid of all the other ones. And finally Elijah says, you know what? I'm going to go confront King Ahab. So he goes and confronts King Ahab. And he essentially proposes a duel of the gods. He goes to Ahab and he says, here's what we're going to do. You're prophets of Baal. We're going to go up on the mountain. We're going to have a face-off. Baal against God. Okay? He says, here's what we're going to do. Your prophets, they're going to take a bull, and they're going to perform a sacrifice. It's fairly traditional fare for them. And you're going to put it on the altar, and cover the altar with firewood like you normally do, and you're going to put this bull on the altar. But here's the thing. You're not allowed to burn this sacrifice yourself. You have to ask Baal to come and do it for you. Okay, so the image is this. There's an altar with firewood and a bull on top, and they're waiting for this pyre to be lit from Baal. And there are 450 prophets, and it says that they're praying and they're dancing, and they're trying to say to Baal, come down and take this sacrifice. And they dance, and they sing, and they pray, and nothing's happening, and they do it more and more and more. And eventually, they give up. So Elijah, who is a little bit arrogant actually, he says, okay, now I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to take the bull, I'm going to put it on the altar with all the firewood. But wait, it gets better. It kind of sounds like an infomercial. Take 4 jars of water, okay? Pour it on it. Boom, we'll make all the firewood soaking wet. Okay, they do it. He says, now do it again. Takes 4 jars of water, they pour it on the altar. He says, one more time, just for giggles. Pours 4 more jars of water on. So the text says, there's the altar, and it's like dripping with water, and there's water all around the ditch. And Elijah begins praying, and here's what the text says. Then the time came for giving the evening gift, the evening sacrifice. And Elijah, the man who spoke for God, came near and said, O Lord, God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, let it be known today that you are the God in Israel. Let it be known that I am your servant, and you have done all of these things at your word. Answer me, O Lord. Answer me so that the people may know you. Then the fire of the Lord fell. It burned up the burnt gift, the wood, the stones, and the dust, and it picked up the water that it was in the ditch. So the prophets of Baal, their sacrifice didn't work so well. And here's this incredible fire that comes and consumes everything, rocks included. They're on the mountain, and God appears. Now, if we're a reader of these texts, if we're sitting around a fire and passing these texts from generation to generation, anytime we see a mountain, what do we expect? God to show up. And when God shows up, something almost always changes. The burning bush means the people get let go from Egypt. Mount Sinai gives the 10 Commandments. And in this story, Elijah proves to King Ahab that Yahweh is the way to go. Which brings us back to Mount Horeb. Same mountain, different character, this time with Elijah. Now, as a result of Elijah's little stunt on the mountain, Jezebel is not happy, and she puts a bounty on his head. And she says, in 24 hours, buddy, you're mine. So Elijah, he takes off. And he runs, and he runs, and he runs, and he ends up at the base of the mountain. Now, this mountain is familiar because we've already seen the burning bush here, and this, the text says, is the mountain of God, so we should expect God to show up. So Elijah is at the base of the mountain, and here is what the text says. He came to a cave and stayed there. The word of the Lord came to him and said, what are you doing here, Elijah? And Elijah said, and pay attention to these words, just remember them. I have been careful to serve the Lord God of all. For the people of Israel have turned away from your agreement. They have torn down your altars and killed with the sword the men who speak for you. Only I am left, and they want to kill me. Okay, so that's why he's there. And God says, go and stand on the mountain of the Lord. So go up to Mount Horeb. And the Lord passed by. And a strong wind tore through the mountains and broke the rocks in pieces before the Lord. But the Lord was not in the wind. And after the wind, the earth shook, but the Lord was not in the shaking of the earth. And after the earth shook, a fire came, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire came the sound of a gentle blowing, or in the Hebrew, a calm. When Elijah heard it, he put his coat over his face and went and stood at the opening of the hole. And I've known this story for a long, long time. But there's one thing I didn't realize about it. I've often assumed that God was in the calm and in the still, small voice. But what if God was in all of those things? Like, take fire, for example. We saw it on the burning bush. We saw smoke coming off of Mount Sinai. We saw fire on the altar. Why wouldn't God be in the fire? Is it because God's not in the fire, or Elijah cannot see God in the fire? The text also does not say that God is in the still small voice. After this event happens, Elijah is asked the same question at the beginning. What are you doing here, Elijah? And what does he respond with? The exact same words that he says before he goes onto the mountain. I've been very careful to serve the Lord God of all, for the people of Israel have turned away from your agreement. They have torn down your altars, they have killed you, and I'm the only one to speak for you. I'm the only one left, and they want to kill me. The exact same words that he says before he goes up are the ones he says while he's on the mountain. Elijah, in this story, fails to see God on the mountain. It's as bad as going to AMW and not having onion rings. He fails. That might be a bit of an exaggeration. He goes on the mountain. His experience unfolds before him, and he's unmoved by what he sees. This is actually the decommissioning of Elijah. In the earthquake, in the fire, in the wind, in the silence, he cannot see God. And he's unchanged by that experience. So I want to leave you in this tension. I want to leave you with a question, or a few questions. What happens when we want to see God, when we're expecting to see God, and God maybe even shows up, but we're unable to see it? What happens when we're like Elijah on the mountain and everything unfolds and we're unable to see it?